Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the 6 determinants of supply, so 6 different factors that can shift the supply curve. Before we get to those, however, I just wanted to briefly review a couple of things you went over yesterday, starting with the law of supply. So remember, when we were talking about the law of supply, it essentially incorporates 2 main ideas. The first is that when the price of a good increases, the amount or the quantity supplied will also increase. Then the opposite is also true. When the price of a good decreases, the amount or the quantity supplied will also decrease. So the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity supplied of that product, they are directly related to each other. When one goes up, the other will also go up. When one goes down, the other will also go down. So that's essentially showing us the law of supply on the supply curve. So whenever we are talking about a change in the quantity supplied, again, that is movement along the supply curve itself, as you can see demonstrated in this graph to the right. Producers have the freedom to adjust their production as the prices change. They will tend to offer more if prices are high so they can make a bigger profit, and then they will also do the opposite. They will tend to offer less if the prices are low. So suppliers offer different amounts at all prices. So now that we have a good understanding of changes in quantity supplied along with the law of demand, now we are going to shift our focus here a little bit to look at the 6 determinants of supply. So these are 6 different factors that will cause the supply curve to either shift to the right or to the left. So either an increase in supply or an overall decrease in supply. Now remember, when we are talking about a change in supply, we are no longer moving along the supply curve. We're talking about a change in the, a shift in the supply curve itself, an overall change in supply. So this is showing us that producers are willing to supply different amounts of their goods at the same price. So there are 6 different factors that will shift the supply curve, other than a change in price. So if we are looking here to this graph at the right, if we assume that the red supply curve, labeled as S, if this is our original supply curve, if we were to see an increase in supply, remember, an increase is always to the right. So this green supply curve, labeled as S plus with the green arrows, it looks like it's going down. However, this is actually an increase in supply. And then the opposite is also true. This sort of brown supply curve with labeled S minus, this is a decrease in supply. Remember, left always equals less. So if we are shifting the supply curve to the left, this is showing us a decrease in supply. And then once again, if we are shifting it to the right, that is an increase in supply. So looking at the first 3 determinants of supply, again, these are the only things that can cause a shift in the supply curve like we see here. These are the only 6 things that will cause a supply curve to move. So the first one is technological advancement. So these are improvements, if you will, if a company makes investments in new technologies, whether it be new machinery, new equipment, new computer systems, whatever it may be, if they make technological advancements that improve their production costs or lower their production costs, as well as increase their productivity, then generally companies will increase their supply as well. Technological advancements generally help to increase supply. If a company doesn't have a lot of technological advancements, then they might have a lower supply. So the opposite could also be true. Number 2, looking at productivity of workers. If a company has efficient, productive workers, trained workers, in other words, then they tend to have a higher overall supply. And then the opposite is also true. If you have workers that are unmotivated or they're untrained and not productive, then we will see a decrease in supply from that company. Now, number 3, this is the change in the cost of production or distribution. Now, keep in mind, if a company produces a product, whatever product that might be, they first have to pay money to get the different materials to make whatever their product is. So if you are a maker of, let's say, bookshelves, you would need the different products, whether it's wood, if you make metal bookshelves, whatever it may be, you need to buy those materials first before you can sell your finished product of a bookshelf. So if the cost of production, if that price of wood goes up, then the overall supply of bookshelves will go down, because businesses, again, they want to save money. If they have to spend more on the cost of producing their good, then they're going to decrease their overall supply. But then the opposite is also true. If the cost of production goes down, if the price of wood starts to decrease, then the bookshelf makers will start to increase their supply, because they are able to make more bookshelves now at essentially a cheaper cost. Then looking at the final three determinants of supply. Number 4, these are producers' expectations of future prices. So when we say producers, we're talking about businesses, these makers of these products. If they expect the price to go up in the future, they will decrease their supply at the moment, because they're saving their supply so that when the time comes in the future, when the prices are getting higher, then they can make more profit in the future at that higher price. But the opposite is also true. If in the future they expect the prices of their product to drop, they will increase their supply right now while the price is higher, so then they can make more profit at the current higher price. Number 5, government regulations and taxes. So let's say the government increases their regulations, rules on companies, if you will, and they also increase their taxes on companies, and then they decrease their subsidies. A subsidy is essentially a break for companies, if you will. So companies want government subsidies. But if the government is putting more regulations or rules on companies, making them pay higher taxes, and decreasing the amount of subsidies or help from the government, then the companies will start to decrease their supply, because they're losing money from the government and they're having to pay more taxes to the government and having to follow more government regulations. So this would cause companies to start to decrease their supply. And then the opposite is also true. Let's say the government gets rid of some regulations. They lessen their rules or their restrictions. They decrease taxes on companies, and then they increase subsidies. So they increase help for companies. Then we will start to see the supply increase overall for these different producers. If they're saving money on taxes, they don't have as many rules to meet anymore, and they're getting help from the government in form of subsidies, they will increase their overall supply. And last but not least, the sixth determinant of supply is the number of sellers. So looking at competition in the market, if you will. Generally speaking, the greater the number of firms, the greater the number of businesses or companies in any given market, the greater the supply. It's just pure and simple math. The more people that produce shoes in a market, the more supply of shoes there will be. And then the opposite is also true. If there aren't a lot of firms in a market, a lot of sellers start to drop out or go out of business, then that will lead to a decrease in supply. So now that we understand the 6 determinants of supply, we're going to practice a little bit here, actually shifting the supply curve. So our first scenario is let's say it's a paper company that provides training to its manufacturing employees. So the market or the supply that we are looking at then is the supply of paper. So the determinant that is causing this change is the productivity of workers. If you're providing training to your workers, they are going to be more productive. So if your workers are more productive, more efficient, that's going to cause an increase in supply. So if we are increasing our supply, let me just get my pen out here. Again, whenever we are increasing something, it will always be to the right. So even though, again, this looks like it's going down, it's actually an increase in supply. So we draw an arrow to the right, draw our new supply curve, and then again, we are going to label that as S2. So this is showing an increase in supply. Now let's look at our next scenario. Let's say the government raises taxes on car manufacturers or car companies. Ford, Chevy, Toyota, let's say they have to pay higher taxes now. So now we're going to look at the supply of cars. Now the determinant of supply that is causing this shift is government regulations and taxes. Again, if businesses have to pay higher taxes or the government puts more regulations on these companies, it is going to decrease their supply. So remember, a decrease is shown always to the left. So we're going to draw an arrow to the left, draw our new supply curve, and label that as S2. So even though it looks like it's higher, it's actually a decrease in supply. Remember, whenever we're looking at decreases or increases, not in price, but in the supply, always look down at the x-axis. So if we were comparing this at the same price, so if this was our price right here, and we were to compare these two, on the original supply curve, this quantity right here is where it was originally supplying, Q1. But now that we shifted the supply curve, if we were to draw a new quantity, you can see that it went to the left. So even though we may be drawing it up above our original supply curve, this is to the left. So left always signifies less. And then finally, last example, let's say the cost of rubber goes down. Now the supply that we are looking at is the supply of tires. Obviously you need rubber to make tires, so the determinant that we're focused on here is the change in the cost of production or distribution. So if the cost of rubber goes down, these tire companies that produce tires, they're saving money on rubber. So if they're saving the money on that, then we're going to see an increase in supply. So once again, we're going to draw our arrow to the right, draw our new supply curve, and we can label that as S2. So again, even though it looks like it's lower, this is actually showing us a decrease, or excuse me, an increase in supply if we were to compare it at the same price. So if this were the same price level here, at this first supply curve, if we were to label it here, again, this is our first quantity. But now that we shifted our supply curve, still at the same price, but this tire company now is offering more at that same price. So this is showing us a shift in supply. So to help hit home the idea of shifting the supply curves, on Schoology you should find an assignment called Supply Practice. This will give you practice not only identifying the determinants of supply, but also being able to shift the supply curve as well. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we will have a short test. It's about 12 questions on the basics of supply and demand. So if you want to review a little bit for that, make sure you are reviewing the following that is listed here: law of demand, the different determinants, how to shift the demand curve. The opposite is also true for the law of supply, the determinants of supply that we just went over, as well as the shifts of a supply curve. And then be sure to also review the difference between elastic as well as inelastic demand. If you have any questions, I will be in my WebEx room today, so feel free to pop in and let me know if you need any help.